much for joining us, president and founder of Defending Education. You know, I can get the vibe from the title of the advocacy group, but tell me a little bit about how you got going. This is not your first rodeo when it comes to political activism, I know that, but it feels like this one is sticking.
Yeah, so I started working on this actually during COVID. At the time, I was running a campus free speech organization, and it felt a little bit petty to sue university when literally students went home from campus for spring break and could not go back and get their stuff for 6 months. But I am from Chicago originally, and all of my friends from home, when school shut down, started texting me saying, how do I get my elementary school to reopen? And I remember thinking to myself, oh, bless your heart, you think they care. But to me, it was an interesting data point, just that people didn't really realize how the system worked. And so that was, I kind of put a pin in that. Fast forward a few months, George Floyd was murdered, and then all these schools around the country started sending out all district emails. We are so racist. We commit to being an anti-racist district. And again, I started getting messages from all my friends at home who were all like Chicago Democrats saying, I think my school just called me a name. What is going on? And I just thought, you know, when you and I were growing up, we didn't get messages like this from our schools during, you know, the Gulf War, the Iraq War. Schools generally didn't weigh in. So that was just kind of another interesting data point to me. For me, the thing that actually flipped the switch was the Wall Street Journal did a profile of a superintendent near where I grew up in a town called Evanston, Illinois. And he said that he was going to reopen schools for Black and brown children before white students in the name of anti-racism. And I remember screaming at my computer saying, you can't do that. That's unconstitutional. And that to me, it was just a signal that the system was really broken. And I thought, you know what, this is, I think K-12 is going to be the next front. I had been working in higher ed for a couple of years. And so I started looking into kind of what resources were out there for families. And it turns out that when you start looking at the issue of civil rights in education, most of it is geared towards college students. It's kangaroo courts on campus. It's Leah Thomas is a swimmer. It's not, can my 8-year-old be forced to do a privilege walk? Can my 14-year-old be compelled to use somebody's pronouns? So I started to just try and build out those resources and then also just document kind of the anecdotes that we were hearing from across the country, because I wanted to show that this wasn't just a Manhattan and a California problem. This is everywhere. This is in middle America. This is in religious schools. This is in red states. Because when people know that something is happening in their backyard, it gives them a reason to get off the sidelines and do something about that. And so we have been working on that for the past couple of years.
So I think, you know, my kids are all in public school. And we have a district, we're sheltered from some of these anecdotes that I hear. So tell me more, elaborate, you know, what is, and also when did this begin? Because I do hear some of these stories and I'm flabbergasted. But I see the video from the school board meetings and I see parents saying, I feel like I'm in a custody battle with the school, and these are my kids.
Yeah.
So let's take a step back. How did we get here?
Sure. Even just looking over the past several years at when we have been operational, I mean, we launched in 2021. That first year, much of what we worked on was actually related to race and DEI initiatives. It was after George Floyd. It was Ibram Kendi. It was the 1619 Project, Robin DiAngelo. So it was very kind of race and national origin heavy. In 2022, a lot of the battles that came on our radar were related to gender. That was when the Biden administration introduced their Title IX rewrite. And so we started hearing a lot from families about concerns related to bathrooms, locker rooms, books, curriculum. We also then started hearing from a number of parent activists we work with on the West Coast about a curriculum called ethnic studies, and how it sounds like it's social studies and multiculturalism, but actually there was a significant amount of anti-Semitism baked into that. And so it was just, we sort of have been almost the canaries in the coal mine, collating all this information that we've heard from parents across the country, most of whom, when they send us tips, would check a box that they want to be anonymous because they credibly feared retaliation, both against themselves and their children. So it's been a lot of different issues, people coming to us for different reasons. But to your point, I think much of this has been going on for many years longer than any of us thought. And that to me was something that was really interesting. I think so many parents for so long dropped their children at the schoolhouse gate and assumed that their kids were getting the same quality education that many of us were getting. And you can look at how, the NAEP scores, the National Association of Educational Progress, the nation's report card. Those scores over the past year, when they came out, the kind of the post-COVID kids, those fell off a cliff. But honestly, even before COVID, those were nothing to write home about. And it is grisly to think of the pandemic as like having a silver lining. But I do think that when schools were suddenly in parents' living rooms and they were able to look over their children's shoulders and see what their kids were learning or frankly were not learning, I think it was a real wake up call for people. And then to suddenly be held at arm's length when families wanted to get involved, when they wanted to know more, was also a little bit of a slap in the face. I mean, I think of when I was growing up, I might have gotten in trouble once or twice, but the school would bring in, my mom to meet with my teacher, my guidance counselor, and say, how do we get her back on track? And it was a real partnership. And unfortunately, in many cases now, it feels that has become a very adversarial relationship where families are just not brought into the process. They're treated as the enemies through policies like parental exclusion policies on gender and things like that. And I think that really worries people.
Okay, I mean, when I'm listening to you, and it feels my first takeaway is that the issues, although let's say the race issues haven't gone away, but it feels as if now we're most recently we're hearing more about the gender issues, the gender identities, and we hear these battles where these parents allege, and you can speak certainly more succinctly, about schools hiding conversations from them with their young, even preteens, about their gender, and parents are being left out of that. Would you argue that that is more of an issue right now, although we still do have the race issue, anti-Semitism and whatnot?
Yeah, I think the gender issue, I think it's sort of the one that's burning most hot right now. Certainly there are 2 cases pending before the Supreme Court on the sports issue. But this parental exclusion issue to me is something that it's tied together, but it is something that was certainly not on my bingo card when we launched this organization. My colleague has been tracking school districts across the country that have these policies that are voted on by school boards, or in some cases imposed by state legislatures, saying that parents don't have a right to know that information. I am haunted by a FOIA that we got, or a tip that we got from Eau Claire School District in northern Wisconsin a couple years ago. And it was a professional development session for teachers, for faculty. And one of the slides said, parents do not have a right to know this information. That knowledge must be earned. And you think, you're a mom, I'm a mom. We have to sign permission slips for aspirin, for sunscreen, for field trips. Yet now we have these public school districts that, with our tax dollars behind our back, are telling our kids, mom and dad might not love you if you're a different gender. Let's keep a secret. And that to me just sets off all kinds of red flags, because we tell our kids always, don't keep secrets from mom and dad. And I think it's also worth noting that it's not just the transgender kids, the gay children that are hearing those messages. It's also the straight kids. A couple years ago, we had sued a school district in Iowa that had one of these policies. And it's a district that had, I think, 5 student-on-teacher sexual relationships over the previous 5 years. And so the idea of encouraging a child to keep a secret, being told that by an authority figure, is something that I think is absolutely unforgivable.
Well, that's like the number one rule. I even remember someone telling me, when I'm disciplining my children, it never say, don't tell dad, like you're a team. There's simply no secrets, even on like me giving you a piece of chocolate. I'm trying to think of a very kind of a meaningless example where you just eliminate the word secret when you're raising children, just so they can have full transparency in that relationship. So I think that from a parental standpoint, that does take my breath away. And I've tried to go through some of the legal action, and certainly your organization has grown. So there's a lot that you're involved in. One of the biggest takeaways was, if I'm not mistaken, your case back in 2023, right? That was the 8th U.S. Circuit Court. Tell me a little bit about that. That has to do with gender ideology. That's why I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, that was this case against this district in Iowa, Linn-Mar, where it had both a speech policy that said you couldn't misgender or mispronoun your peers, as well as this parental exclusion policy. We're structured as a membership association. So when we sue a district or a university, it's defending education versus a school, instead of Nicki and Sarah versus a school district. It gives the families anonymity, and then it also helps us with standing, because if the family decides, I've had enough, I'm transferring, then the case doesn't go away, that other families in the district can still benefit from a good ruling in that. We had, of the 6 families we work with, 2 of them were special needs families. And that policy in particular said 7th grade and up, the gender would be secret. One of the families, the child was above that age, but had a much lower mental age because of a disability. And another family, the child had been adopted and had been abused prior. And so it was a child that didn't know boundaries. And so things like that, I think, are things where it's really disturbing to sort of know that that's what's taking place in schools. But again, we've seen these happen in districts across the country. We have, I think, 1,200 districts and counting that we're tracking. We have flagged this for a number of state attorneys general. We have spoken to the federal Department of Education about this because it really, I think it fundamentally undermines parental rights, because it really is degrading that parent-child relationship. For a school official to tell your kids that you might not love them, I mean, that is, once that relationship is severed, it's very hard and very difficult and complicated to get it back. And it shouldn't be happening in the finite school day with our district's resources.
Well, to me also as a parent, when I listen and I read more about, I know you've got a preliminary injunction, if I'm not mistaken. That one is also about biological pronouns. For me, I take a step back because it feels as if we're making life so confusing for these kids that it is already confusing to learn algebra and geometry and learn handwriting and financial literacy, all these things that we're imposing on our kids. They're getting slapped with now social issues that I don't feel like they need to be faced with. Is that a true statement?
Yes, I think that's right. And also, I mean, again, like, let's go back to proficiency, quality. I think that's where, 100% of parents in America actually expect their children to learn something when they go to college, to school. They have our kids for 7 or 8 hours a day. And I expect my children to learn math, to learn reading, to learn science, to actually master these subjects. But when they're spending hours a day on emotions and feelings and identity politics, then when are they actually going to get to the meat of why I sent them there? That is something I think that really worries me as well. We keep hearing over and over again, schools are underfunded, teachers are underpaid. What are those resources going towards? Are there more teachers in the classroom, or are there more middle managers? What kind of programming is taking place? When there is a teacher in service day for professional development, I have to pay $100 a child a day to find, a day camp, a babysitter or something. These are real costs that are being imposed on families. And if they are not learning how to teach phonics better, but they're learning how to program my child on identity politics, I don't know if that's a great use of resources on anybody's behalf. And so it's just watching, I think, schools and school officials lose the plot on a number of these things is something that is deeply frustrating from somebody who does have kids in the system.
So there's an opportunity, right? Over the next, we've got 7 months before the midterms. Although you do have a lot of legal work that you're working on, as you mentioned, you're sort of keeping the pulse of a number of districts across the country. Do you have goals coming up in the next 7 months on policy leaders across the nation?
One thing we are trying really hard to encourage Congress to do is to actually lock in a lot of the promises that President Trump made. I think in particular about Title IX. As fun as, I have been working in politics in DC for 20 years. And it feels, every 4 to 8 years, we have this whiplash about Title IX. I started working on it back in the day when I remember schools getting rid of wrestling, like a men's wrestling team, because there wasn't a women's wrestling team. That was like a quaint old version of our interpretation of Title IX. Versus where it is now. And I so badly want to get off this roller coaster. I would like to not have to do this anymore. Have to argue about what the plain text of the word sex meant in 1972 when Title IX was ratified. So that's something I would really like locked in. I think, thinking back to 2023 Students for Fair Admissions Supreme Court decision, the Trump administration under Secretary McMahon put out a broad guidance document last February, interpreting that to mean that you can't discriminate in many other school settings. I think things like that really need to be clarified again, so that we don't have to decide what is or is not discrimination every few years. And so things like that, I would love Congress to move on. Clearly, I think with the 1-seat majority, not much is moving at this moment in time. But again, just to encourage everybody just to stay focused on, at the end of the day, we want our children to learn. And nobody is talking about that. It feels like there's a lot of shiny objects without a lot of attention being paid to actual quality.
Well, when you talk about, was the Biden administration, there were some intentions and some wording around Title IX, but is it safe to say that was posturing? Nothing really changed. Is that right?
Well, the rule was put through. It was challenged. I think there were 10 court cases, including one by us in the 11th Circuit. Those have largely, the rule has been enjoined, but as those cases have been remanded back down to the lower courts, there have been a number of interveners that have tried to keep the rule alive because clearly the federal government is not defending that anymore. And so it is still very much a live issue, unfortunately. And so just for some regulatory certainty, some legislative certainty, at the end of the day, we don't want a president acting with just a pen and a phone, as President Obama said years ago. We want Congress to act. We want Congress to lock things in and actually make clear what they want and how they want things executed. And so that's my hope.
blue sky that for me. What does that look like for you? And then also, it sounds like you've created an army. Like, what are you amassing now? What's the size of your organization? And do you feel as if sometimes you're drinking water out of a water hose because it seems like you're growing really fast?
Yeah, I mean, it's ideally, I would love to work myself out of a job. We have been trying to, as you said, build an army so that all of these people can go and articulate and keep an eye on their own school districts or their universities themselves. I mean, you and I have watched the collapse of the local news industry over the past 20 years. There used to be reporters that would go to a school board meeting, to a city council meeting, and keep an eye on these things and keep the local community informed. That's not happening anymore. And so we have a lot of school districts that are signing dubious contracts or approving strange things that I think the community wouldn't necessarily agree with. And so I think that's something that's really important. I watched the Tea Party die 15 years ago, and I don't want that to happen with this parent movement. Because one of the funny things about this is, I've been doing this for 5 years, but some of the parents who we started out doing this with, everybody's getting older. Their kids are getting older. They're cycling out of this. And so I'm very focused right now on trying to build the bench, making sure that there are people waiting in the wings who can speak the language, who know how the policies work, who know what the levers of power are in their local district, in their state. K-12 education is fundamentally a state and a local issue for a good reason. But that means that there's a lot of opportunities to engage with state legislators, with state boards of education. And I think for so long, Americans' civic engagement muscles have frankly become atrophied. So that's why I think we saw in 2020 a lot of people who were screaming at school boards, not knowing how the system actually worked. And so we want people to be able to come in alongside and be good faith partners in the best interest of our children. Like that is my kind of blue sky goal. I think we're probably a little bit far off from that right now. Every time we do a congressional fly-in and bring parents in to meet with members of Congress or committees, we get a lot of there ought to be a law. And I think, I don't know if you want that. What would President Pritzker, what would House Speaker Hakeem Jeffries do with those powers? It is better for things to be solved and adjudicated at a lower level, but with great power comes great responsibility. So we need people that are showing up at meetings, are volunteering at their schools, making sure that things are not going off the rails.
Okay, so let me since I don't have a panel, play a little devil's advocate here. Accusations that you are a far right group that is pushing a narrative and that these kids need to learn all of these emotional adjectives and the history of the United States that some people think are, I'm trying to think of ways that people will hit at your group when they say, like, for example, the dismantling of the Department of Education is only going to hurt those state and local groups that don't have the resources, right? So all of these critics saying, no, this isn't right. We are on the right path. You're on the wrong path. What would you say to that?
I think the test scores speak for themselves. I think, we have dumped, you look at the amount of money that has been spent on public education in America over the past 40 years since the creation of the Department of Education, trillions of dollars with lower achievement, lower actual expectations. And one thing that has been sort of interesting has been to catch states, red states and blue states alike, undermining and lowering their own standards, what's called the cut scores. And so for a state to say, this is what proficiency is not the same as what proficiency was 30 years ago. And so it's almost like comparing apples to oranges. I found this during COVID. I mean, I looked at, when my school would say that my kids were on grade level, I thought, my son's only reading a graphic novel. I don't think he is. I remember reading long, full-length books when I was that age. And so there is sort of that gut feeling and then almost being gaslit by school officials who are saying, no, everything's fine, when you know in your gut it's not fine. So that was something really that worries me. I do think that a lot of these issues are very values laden. These are things that families can and should be discussing with their children over the dinner table, having these kind of conversations about love, about sex, about identity. And so for a school to step in and then say, this is the right way. There is one way to think about it. Maybe your family is a little bit biased. I mean, again, why are you trying to artificially throw up these boundaries? I have no problem with teaching history. My grandparents on my father's side actually met in an internment camp. I grew up in a Jewish suburb. My children ask me to do Hanukkah every year. So I very much believe in a multicultural society. I have gay cousins. This is just to say that we are hateful, I think really it's an ad hominem attack designed to chill the speech of people who have different values, unfortunately, because at the end of the day, we all love and want our children to succeed. But when our schools are spending their time on everything but teaching our children, I think parents do have a righteous grievance.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting when you say you should be having these conversations, and you should be teaching your kids about what does a transgender person look like, and their beliefs, and how they may align or not align with yours, and how it doesn't make anything right or wrong. But your point is, what I'm hearing is that these conversations happen within a household, and that the schools have simply overstepped their boundaries, that they're encroaching on a role that a parent should fill. That's what I'm hearing.
Yes, I mean, let's look at, I mean, that case that was at the Supreme Court last term in Montgomery County, Maryland, Mahmoud. There were families, it was a broad religious coalition, including Muslim families, Jewish families, Christian families, that said, I'm not comfortable with you teaching my children at very young ages about a lot of these topics. And the school district got rid of their opt-out policy altogether. And they said, no, we will, sorry, pound sand. I mean, that's a very strange thing to do as a public school system, to say, no, it's our way or the highway. I had a similar experience with my kids in a private school, where when I wanted to opt my son out of pretty explicit sexual lessons, they told me they tried to make it as inconvenient as possible. They said I had to come and physically pick him up instead of putting him into the library for an hour while his sister was still in school. It was us and a Muslim family that were the two families that opted out of the curriculum. And when they try and make it as difficult and inconvenient as possible, I mean, we have heard stories of kids whose children come home from school and the kids are shamed by the teacher. Johnny has to go in the kitchen, in the library, because his mom doesn't want him to learn this. I mean, really trying to imply, peer pressure and humiliation. That is not a partnership. That's adversarial, and that's concerning.
Well, it's also disconcerting because you're right. We're all on the same team. I mean, we're not going to be around forever. So this is a generation that we're all invested in, right? These are people who we want to succeed. So before I let you go, your plan for the next 7 months, and your hope for the organization as we head into, of course, you and I will be having a conversation a couple of years from now about another election. So it's never going to stop, right? But I've listened to the ebb and flows of sort of what battles you've been fighting over the past couple of years since post-COVID, since 2021. So really wrap up your battle for the next 7 months or so.
Yeah, I mean, we're continuing to try and educate, file lots of civil rights complaints so the Department of Education can step in, and when there are cases of significant either racial or sex discrimination, that they can adjudicate those the proper way. We have a number of lawsuits in the can right now, both at the university level as well as K-12, on issues of compelled speech, bias response teams, things like that. Because unfortunately, even though there's a new administration in, and I think there's a lot of parents around America that assumed that after Inauguration Day last year, a lot of these fights would be won, they're not. We're watching a lot of schools just put lipstick on a pig, rename departments, move people around, but still continue to do the same kinds of programming, and just try and wait out the administration. So that's something that's been interesting to me. And so it feels very much like the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. We'll keep an eye out on things. And through our parent network, our early warning system, who knows? I didn't have the anti-Semitism in the wake of October 7th kind of in my strategic plans for 2 years ago, but we ended up throwing ourselves into that because we found that it was as bad in K-12 schools as it was in universities. It was just less documented. And so we stand ready to keep an eye out and to flag for policymakers as need be.
Yeah, unbelievable. Nicki, thank you so much for joining us. I know that we'll have you back. We've got a busy calendar ahead, so please keep us in mind.
Thank you.
Thanks.